Yeah, so I was looking at some of the math calculations I'm going to do in this talk, so you're going to need to put on your math brain. So I'm going to talk a little bit about greenhouse lighting. And of course in New York, where I'm from, it's very, very important. We have Great Lakes cloud cover, and so we have really poor winter light conditions. And so I'll give you examples with lettuce, for example. It will take us 3 times, 4 times longer to grow a lettuce crop in the wintertime if we don't have supplemental light. But we'll look at this, So what does light control? Pretty much everything, right? Like plants photosynthesize, but beyond just biomass accumulation and photosynthesis, light are the cues to the plant, like Joyce said, related to plant height and branching, flowering, and stress tolerance, and so on. So we'll be mainly talking about supplemental lighting for plant biomass or yield, but I just wanted to remind you that it controls a range of processes. So we'll be talking about photosynthetic lighting, mainly for like flower growers. They would need to be also concerned about photoperiodic lighting. So for example, some flowers need long days. Some plants need long days as their cue to flower. And so like petunias are an example of that. They flower much quicker if they're exposed to long days. And so what you can do is trick the plant into thinking they have long days by giving them pretty low amounts of light in the middle of the night from 10 p.m. until 2 a.m. They think they have a short night period, and it induces flowering. But for our vegetable crops, they're not particularly responsive to that photoperiodic lighting. And then light quality, as Joyce also talked about as well too. So higher far red light that you would get from that shade response can give you taller plants, for example. So diving into greenhouse supplemental lighting, so Joyce used this unit of foot candles, which is kind of light as how humans see it. What we really see well is green light, and we're not so good at seeing either blue light or red light. And in fact, this is actually why some of the newer fire trucks that you see are painted yellow, because we actually see the color yellow much better than we see the color red. And in terms of what plants see, this is what plants see for light for photosynthesis. So from 400 nanometers, this is blue light. Then we're moving up to the green light in the 500 nanometers, and then into yellow and orange, and then we're moving into red in kind of the 600 and 700 nanometers. So what we see is plants have this peak in red, where they photosynthesize a bit better when they have red light. They also have this secondary peak in blue light, where blue is a little bit better. And then, but in general, they're pretty good at using all of these wavelengths of light from 400 to 700 nanometers. What you will see sometimes, which I think can be confusing, is you will see these huge peaks in blue and red. Sometimes you'll see these by LED companies, and they'll say that plants only use light that's red or blue, and all of the other light is wasted. And that's not true. What those graphs are is what chlorophyll itself absorbs. So if you isolate the chloroplast from the plant, it absorbs only red and blue. But in plant leaves, there's lots of accessory pigments that shunt light or scavenge light from all these different wavelengths and drive it into those chlorophyll centers, so that plants are pretty good at using all of this light between 400 and 700 nanometers. So the unit that we use to describe the quantity of light, if we're taking a one-time measurement, an instantaneous measurement, is micromoles per meter squared per second. And what that is it's how many photons of light. A photon is a little tiny particle of light, and moles are a really big number. A mole is 6 times 10 to the 23rd. A micromole is 6 times 10 to the 17th. So it's 6 times 10 to the 17th photons of light hitting a square meter per second. So you don't really have to understand that. Just know that this is the unit that we use. And it's all of those photons of light between 400 and 700 nanometers, because those are the light that's important for photosynthesis. Now, if we connect a light sensor to like a data logger and we record the light that we're getting like every 10 minutes, and we average that and integrate it over a day, then we get this measure of the total amount of light that we get during the day, which is the daily light integral. And so at this point, the unit that we're using is moles, so 6 times 10 to the 23rd of photons of light per meter squared per day. So it's kind of like having your rain bucket and seeing how many photons of light accumulated on your plants over that day. And I'll show you how to convert between the two, so if you like math. So we just need to remember that an hour has 3,600 seconds, and that there's 1 million micromoles per 1 mole. And so an example, let's assume that we have a high pressure sodium light that's lighting our plants at 100 micromoles per meter squared per second. So we measured that with the instantaneous light sensor. And now let's say we have this lamp on a timer that's on for 12 hours a day. We can calculate how much total light it gives us over that day. So we just multiply 100 micromoles per meter squared per second times 3,600 seconds per hour times 12 hours. And then we divide that by 1 million, because there's 1 million micromoles per mole. And it tells us we got 4.32 moles per meter squared per day. And what we'll talk about in a minute is what are good optimum targets for these moles per meter squared per day. And I think
this relate to average person going in the store and buying a fluorescent tube.
yes. So
Soft light, cool light, or whatever.
So what we would need is someone to come in with a light sensor and measure that instantaneous light intensity under it. It has to be measured for each type of lamp, and then we can do these calculations of how much total light you're getting for it. But I'm going to show you also how to do some rough estimates where you can kind of figure out for a given lamp if you can ask the manufacturer its light output, and I'll show you all these units and things. You can calculate about how many square feet it should be able to light for a target intensity. Yes?
Okay. A regular light meter won't measure LED light.
So I'll show you the, unfortunately you have to get the more expensive light meters.
So you can get a quantum meter, which measures moles, right?
Yeah.
Does it give you a reading in moles?
So it'll tell you micromoles per meter squared per second.
Yeah, that
Yep.
gives you the intensity of the light.
Yeah.
And the accumulation of that is your daily light level.
Right, yeah.
Right, but how do you convert the moles of light to what Joyce is talking about to foot candles?
Oh,
and
yes.
the regular light.
So it's pretty difficult, and it's lamp specific, like you say. Like for high pressure sodium lights, for high pressure sodium lights, we have a good conversion factor where we multiply micromoles times 5 to give us foot candles. So if you're measuring 100 micromoles of light under your high pressure sodium light, that's about 500 foot candles of light.
So you multiply it by 5.
Yeah, and if you have it in foot candles, then you just divide it by 5 to get micromoles. But as you're alluding to, this conversion factor is different for each type of lamp, and so for LED lamps, you can't really know what the conversion factor is without having about a $2,000 piece of equipment, a spectroradiometer, to measure that. Yes, or talking to the manufacturer. So these are the light sensors that you would typically use, these quantum sensors. The kind of gold standard in the industry are these Lycor light sensors. You can either get the sensor connected to a data logger, or you can get a handheld meter, which is what you'll see this afternoon that we brought to demonstrate at Schuyler Greens. So about $1,200 each, unfortunately. And then Apogee makes these cheaper sensors, these handheld units that are about $330. They used to be not particularly good with LED lights. Again, kind of related to those conversion factors and things, but they have improved them in the last year or two, and I think they're decently trustworthy now under LEDs as well. So in terms of this photosynthetically active light, so all the light between 400 and 700 nanometers, it's that total quantity of light that the plants get that's important. Here's a study I did, I guess 15 years ago when I was a master's student, looking at growth of pansy under different daily light integrals. So these were seedlings that were transplanted. They had 10 moles of light per day, maybe 8, all the way up to 30 moles of light per day. And you can see that there were dramatic effects. So the more photosynthesis and biomass that the plants were able to accumulate, they were able to grow and branch and flower quicker than their counterparts under low light. And so in this case with pansies, you could produce a nice marketable crop of pansies in 30 days if you had them under really high light, or it would take like 60 or 70 days if they were under low light. So for flower crops, which we're not really talking about today, but I just want to point out, we can get away with typically lower light levels because we're not selling like bushels of wheat or pounds of tomatoes. We just need to produce a high quality plant that's kind of in flower and filling out the container. So we're typically looking at about 10 to 12 moles of light per meter squared per day. And there's a really nice resource out of Purdue because floriculture crops, there's hundreds of different crops, right? So there's a good resource with some of the more common crops as to how many moles you need for good crop quality. So but we'll talk more then about vegetables. And for vegetables, where we're selling grams or pounds that we grew, right? So the more photosynthesis we have, the more crop we're able to sell. So the kind of thing that we follow is that for every 1% more light the plants get, you also get 1% more yield. And this holds up pretty well for lettuce, herbs, tomatoes, peppers, and cucumbers. However, for lettuce, we have this cap in that we can't grow lettuce too fast because if we have too much light, we get leaf tip burn. And I'll show you pictures of that in a minute. So our typical target would be, if we want to push lettuce as quickly as possible, we would have 17 moles per meter squared per day of light. And we need good airflow as well, so we need to have this driving force for the plants to take up enough calcium. If we don't have good airflow, and we'll see vertical airflow fans at Schuyler Farms or Schuyler Greens, then we need to have a lower light target. So we can't grow lettuce as fast, we can't really push it, otherwise we'll get this leaf tip burn from low calcium. And for herbs as well, this it's been studied less than lettuce, but 12 to 17 moles per meter squared per day seems to give us optimum light, so that 17 moles works very well for herbs. So if we have lower light levels than these targets, it means that you're either going to have a longer crop time. So if you're always harvesting a head of lettuce at the same stage, maybe it needs to be 8 ounces to be harvestable, then it means that you're going to have a longer crop time to achieve that. Or the alternative is if you want to harvest it at the same number of days after transplanting. So if you always harvest your heads of lettuce 4 weeks after transplanting, if you have lower light, it means it's just going to weigh less. So if you have half as much light, instead of weighing at 8 ounces, it's going to weigh 4 ounces. So with head lettuce, 17 moles per meter squared per day is our target. We still have to have good airflow for this. If we have more than 17, we get tip burn, or if there's poor airflow, we have tip burn issues. And so this comes from our Cornell CEA group. If we grow a 5-ounce head of lettuce, which is kind of our standard, it takes 35 days from seed to a 5 to 6 ounce head of lettuce at 17 moles of light. If we only have 5 moles of light, which is what we have in New York in the wintertime, it takes us 120 days to produce that same head of lettuce. And it still might have quality issues, like it might be a taller, spindlier plant that's kind of a weaker plant. In Virginia, we'd have to look at your weather files, but I suspect your winters might be more like 8 to 10 moles of light. So this is what leaf tip burn looks like. This is where the center of the head of lettuce has this marginal, so the leaf edges have this browning and disfigurement. And what it is there's poor calcium supply to that growing tip. And so we especially see this in head lettuce as it nears maturity. Those outer leaves start to wrap around those inner leaves, and then we have poor airflow at that tip. That airflow is what is needed to drive plant evaporation, which is the driving force for calcium to get to that tip. And calcium's needed as kind of the glue that holds cell walls together. So just like we need calcium for bones in our body, plants need calcium as part of their structure for their cell walls. So if we grow the plant too fast, we find that the roots can't take up enough calcium for the tip of the plant. Or if we have poor airflow, that's also a problem. My colleague at Iowa State University, Chris Curry, has done some nice work looking at herbs and daily light integral. So he just had 2 treatments in these studies, so 7 moles per meter squared per day of light, so that would be kind of wintertime lighting conditions with no supplemental light, versus 14 moles of light per day. And he'll get double the yield. So if he gets double the light, he gets double the fresh weight. For sweet basil, this example for flatleaf parsley, if he doubles the light, he actually gets about 2.5 times the yield, which is kind of interesting. So it's beyond that 1% rule. And this was his example for cilantro, where again he saw even more than double the yield when he doubled the daily light integral. And so for our vine crops that we grow, like cucumbers, tomatoes, and sweet peppers, they require even higher light than lettuce. So for cucumbers, we want a minimum of 15 moles per meter squared per day just to get anywhere near decent yields. For tomatoes and sweet peppers, about 20 moles per meter squared per day. And more is better. They don't have tip burn issues, so you can get past 30, 40 moles of light would be wonderful. So they'll be happy to take all the light that you can give them. Sometimes if we're growing these crops in the summertime, we can't give them all the light just because we need to control temperature in the greenhouse, so we might have to have our shade curtains deployed during the middle of the day to keep temperature in check. And then strawberries, we would want about 17 moles minimum and then greater than 20 moles for optimum growth.
I have a question on that.
Yes.
The strawberries, does that also affect the day neutral?
Yeah, right. So then day neutral, so then that's related to the photoperiod or the day length that induces flowering. So these day neutral strawberries are not like the June bearing or the long day strawberry, so they keep flowering and making fruit regardless of what the day length is, but they still need, in terms of getting higher yields, you still need a pretty high amount of light. And so we haven't done that much with strawberries, but when we grow them at Cornell, our yields go way, way down in the wintertime if we don't have light on them. Yes?
On average, how many hours of light do these plants need?
Oh yeah, so it all depends on what the how many lamps you have in your greenhouse and what intensity they're delivering it at. Then we can calculate how many hours a day they need to be on. That makes sense. So if you only had 2 lamps in the greenhouse, you'd probably want, for lettuce, you'd want to have them on 24/7 to get any kind of benefit from them, right? And lettuce, you can get away with having light on 24/7.
Can you actually run the light for 24 hours?
For lettuce, you can. For tomatoes, you need a 4 or 6 hour dark period. So what will happen with tomatoes is they need that dark period. That's the cue for the carbohydrates that were fixed in the leaves to get transported to the fruits. And you get this physiological disorder, these brown leaf spots that develop if you light 24/7 for tomatoes.
So that kind of segues into my question.
Sure,
The
yeah.
light-dark regime.
Yeah.
So 24/7 or 16/8, 24.
Yes.
The total kind of
So
accumulation?
for leafy greens, if we'll do this at Cornell. If we've calculated how much lighting capacity we get per hour, and on our really dark days, we need to have the lights on 24/7 to get our 17 moles of light. So what we advocate for doing actually is talking to your greenhouse control company and setting up a schedule where it's not just on a timer, so your lights aren't just on for like 12 hours a day or 16 hours a day, but you're actually measuring how much light you get from the outside and then calculating how many hours a day your lamps need to be on to reach a target light level. Yeah. This was just our example of growing tomatoes in Ithaca, New York, in the wintertime under 10 moles per meter squared per day of light versus 20 moles per meter squared per light. So that 1% rule kind of more than held up of 1% more light is 1% more yield. So what I really want to talk about now is comparing the energy efficiency of greenhouse lighting fixtures and how to do some of these calculations yourself, like comparing whether it makes sense to buy a certain type of lamp. So we did this study that was funded by our State Energy Research and Development Authority, where we looked at the 2 different types of high pressure sodium lights, and then 6 or so different types of LED lights. And we looked at what their power consumption was, but also we had a colleague that has an integrating light sphere, a $100,000 piece of equipment, measure the total output from the light. And then from that, we could calculate this wall plug efficacy. So how many moles of light you get per kilowatt hour of electricity. So this is really kind of an apples to apples comparison of how much light output you get for every unit of electricity consumed. And then what we found is that these high pressure sodium lights, there was only 2 of the LEDs that we looked at in a Lumitex Power Harvest that was better in terms of energy efficiency than the high pressure sodium lights. And then Philips Green Power was by far the best. So it was about 40% more efficient than high pressure sodium lights. 5 minutes. Okay, so I got to race through this. But then we had to look at the cost per fixture and then how many fixtures you would need in the greenhouse. So another quick point is that we did trials with baby leaf greens under these different types of lamps, where we used the lamps. They were adjusted to control the light intensity at the crop level, and then they each had a light sensor under them to make sure that each treatment got the same daily light integral, regardless of which lamp they were grown under. And we looked at crop yield. So we also wanted to see, well, did the LEDs perform better if we use them at the same light intensity? And the 2 high pressure sodium lights that we used are here on the right side. This is yield of lettuce in ounces per square foot. And then we had the LED lights here. And what we found actually, and then no supplemental light, which the lights gave us about half of our daily light integral, we had about half the yield. But what we found is there were some subtle differences based on the light source, but there were not any statistically significant differences. What this means to me is that these LEDs, at least when we have a background of sunlight, LEDs aren't giving us any kind of magical light. It's just all about how much total light you get from them, right? So photons of light are photons of light. So then it should go back to energy efficiency and which ones are more energy efficient. So I'm going to need to skip these calculations because of time. But I have a nice article that just came out in eGrow that can walk you through it. So shoot me an email or give me your business card. And I also have a calculator where if you have the target instantaneous light intensity, and then you have to talk to the manufacturer to get the total lamp output. And then if we know if we can estimate the number of hours our lights are on per day averaged over the year, we can calculate the cost of buying lamps and keeping them lit for a year, and then you can do these apples to apples comparisons. So for so I'll just show you the numbers. So for these 2 high pressure sodium lights, we needed 473 and 742 to light a 1 acre greenhouse. This is at pretty high light. This is in my New York conditions. You could probably get away with about half this light in your Virginia conditions. Versus some of these lights, these LED lights, like this Veloya, because it only uses 150 watts of electricity, and it wasn't any more efficient than the high-pressure sodium lights. We actually need 4,000 of these lamps at a cost of $4 million to equip a 1-acre greenhouse. So notice the high-pressure sodium lights, it cost about $200,000 to equip a 1-acre greenhouse. Even our best LEDs, we're looking at $750,000 to equip. So again, your cost would be about half that because you have more light in Virginia. And then we wanted to look at, well, could you recoup that based on the electricity that you saved from these LEDs? So we have, in our case for lettuce in New York, we had to have the lamps on for 2,600 hours a year. So at about 1.3 million kilowatt hours of electricity for a 1-acre greenhouse per year. The best LEDs that were more efficient, the Illumintex was a little bit less. The Philips then was about 40% less, right, because it was about 40% more efficient. So then we have our electricity cost per year. So the best LED Philips, top lighting, we could save about $50,000 a year on our electricity cost. But if it costs $500,000 more to install those lights in a greenhouse, that kind of simple payback would be 20 years, right? Or 10 years in this case. So that's not quite economical yet, right? Like you probably want to pay back at like 3 years or less before you would make a decision in your operation. So maybe I need to close it there time-wise, but we can talk more about lighting. I can email you more information about lighting. What I really advocate growers do is use these, like the calculator tool that I have online, and you can kind of do your own comparison of does it make sense to upgrade lights or buy LED lights in my operation. So it will be, the LEDs will continue to improve in efficiency and their costs are going to go down over time. So maybe in like 3 or 5 years from now, it's going to make sense for growers to start installing those. It's kind of like buying a VCR in 1984, right? You're the first one to adopt a new technology, you're going to pay more for it at first. Okay, so with that, I'll close there and we'll move on to the next speaker. Thanks.